All right, we're here today, June the 9th, 2018, with Captain Jesse Gilman, who served in the U.S. Army from May of 2000 until May of 2007. He had tours of duty in Bosnia, Korea, and Iraq. So first, we'll just start off and tell me how you got involved in the military.
So military service in my family goes back forever, basically. So we have in the U.S. some ancestors of mine fought in King Philip's War, which was before the French and Indian War. And then they fought in that, and then the Revolutionary War, and on and on and on. So my great grandfather went down and chased after Pancho Villa, and then my grandfathers, both my mother and my father's parents, were in World War II. My dad was in the Air Force for about 30 years, and so I really wanted to fly planes ever since I was a kid. I grew up near an Air Force base, and I had glasses, and they wouldn't let me fly. And so I was depressed about that, and one of my good friends in high school had just went and talked to an Army recruiter, and they were telling him all kinds of wonderful stories about West Point. And since I grew up in a military family, I knew enough to know that military academies were not exactly the most fun place. But I got a packet for ROTC anyway, and I filled it out and went and talked to some people and said, oh yeah, in the Army, like I've seen loads of helicopter pilots with glasses. You can fly for us. I said, that sounds awesome. Let's do it. So I put in the paperwork. I was accepted. So I was in ROTC, and I think it was the year before I graduated, the Army said, we have enough candidates for pilots. Now we have a requirement that you have to have glasses, or you can't have glasses. And so I had met a bunch of engineer officers while I was in, and I was a mechanical engineering student, and I decided that I wanted to be an engineer. And so that's what I was. So I didn't get to fly, I got to ride a lot, but that's how I joined up.
So you were wanting to get in to be a helicopter pilot, you mean?
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to be a helicopter pilot. I also, I wanted, my parents had stressed on my brother and I growing up that we had to figure out how to pay for college, that they'd saved up a little bit, but what they saved up, they didn't realize wasn't going to be anywhere near enough. And so my brother was a genius and this very studious person, and he went through school on scholarships, and I wasn't as studious, and so I liked this idea of, I make a bargain with you, you pay for my school, and I go help you out. And then on top of that, like, I'd grown up around Air Force people and Air Force bases and in the military pretty strong.
So when you realized you were going to be trying to go the engineering route, what sort of things did you have in mind you're going to be doing as an engineer?
Well, so again, partly because I knew enough military officers who were engineers. Like, engineers do everything from building bridges, float bridges, so I got to actually be a platoon leader on a float platoon when I was still a cadet, and so we had boats and the inflatable pieces, and that was down in Louisiana. But then they also put in and take out landmines, handle explosives, and like an engineer's kind of like the wizard who stands next to the king. Like, their job is to advise the infantry commander how to do things, more wisely than they were planning on doing it. And sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. But so one of my first jobs is when I was a platoon leader, so a brand new lieutenant. I was in Hawaii, and so I was part of the 65th Engineer Battalion, and we were attached to the 25th Infantry Division. So as a platoon leader, I had an infantry battalion that my platoon supported. So everywhere they went and everything they did, we went with them and helped them out with engineer efforts. And we were getting ready to do a live fire exercise. So all the bullets and missiles and grenades and all this stuff. And they wanted to build some bunkers. And so I drew up some designs, and they said, hey, can your guys build the bunkers for us? And I said, look, we have our own training we got to do. I can't build your bunkers, but we can have excavators go out, these little pickup trucks called C's that have a backhoe on it, and they can dig out the hole, and then you just put it in the bags, and here's the designs of how you lay it out. Okay, I'll even come check on it. Okay. So I sent a couple of my sergeants to like supervise these infantrymen, and I drive up, and like there's this mess, like it's just muddy as all hell because it's Hawaii, so it rains a bunch. There's a bunch of red infantrymen because the dirt's red, and I hear this fire in the hole, and then kaboom, and this wall of sandbags collapses down on somebody. And I run up there, he's like, who the hell is that? Well, it's the company commander who was assigned to build these things because he didn't want to risk one of his men's lives, so he decided to do it. And they hadn't bothered to read any of the instructions or learn how to do it at all. I'm like, what the hell is wrong with you? I'm cursing him out. And then I realized that I'm in a very, very clean uniform on top of this hill, standing next to this guy who they just dug out of the red dirt, surrounded by this mob of red infantrymen who'd basically been playing King of the Hill for the past however long. So I got kind of pounded red for a while. And yeah, so they don't always listen, but
Okay,
you always work for them.
So you, back up for a second. So you went into the military and you were an RTC, you said. So you came out as an officer.
Yes.
Right? What's the rank you come out at as an officer?
Second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant. Okay. So how was the training and how was the schooling? Like, can you describe, was the training tough for you? Like the basic training itself or anything like that?
No, and they do kind of a different type of basic training. So over the course of the 4 years, we every Thursday we'd get together and they try to drill you on basic infantryman tactics. And in the mornings you do PTs, you get into shape, and we did a few other different types of things. So we have, the ROTC has this thing called the Best Ranger Challenge, which is you throw mock grenades for targets, and you disassemble and reassemble weapons, and you build rope bridges, and you run with full gear and all that type of thing. So I got really, really good at taking apart and putting back together weapons. And then there's a set of training at Fort Lewis where all the ROTC cadets come through, and they do, you throw grenades, you call in artillery fire to blow up targets. You do a bunch of different marksmanship training. You do a bunch of training in the woods. Again, all of what they're teaching you is infantryman basic squad leader, platoon leader tactics to practice being in charge. And one of the best things about the way they train you is you get a week or two or a day or whatever of being in charge, and then you get evaluated on it, and then you go back and you sit and think about what you did. And you think about how did it work, did it not work, were you bad at it? You get to watch the other people go through the exact same drill. You get to help them out while they're doing their different thing, and then you get a chance to try it again. And I think they basically borrowed it all from Ranger School, because Ranger School does that exact same thing. And the brilliant thing is you get so many opportunities to be in charge, and so many opportunities to realize how to better think about all the different things that can go right and can go wrong, and how to motivate people, and how to kick people in the butt when they need to be kicked in the butt, and be nice when they need to be nice. And so by the time you finally become a second lieutenant, even after that, there's a specific to your branch educational school. So this is just for engineers. It's about 6 months where you go through an intensive explosives, landmines, building bridges and roads, and basically all the things that engineers would do. Like, you plumb a toilet if you've never plumbed a toilet before. You put in electric lines in a house if you've never done that before. And so by the time you get out, you've had a chance, and as long as you've paid attention, to have been in charge and not been in charge. So maybe you're more sympathetic when you're a platoon leader.
So as an engineer, do you get, so let's say you're in the field. Are you responsible for any of those activities, or do you actually pick a direction? You go, like, you want to be a demolitions guy, or you want to be a construction guy, or what have you?
So the enlisted guys have generic or have specific MOSs. Officers have generic MOSs. So you're expected mission operation specialty.
Okay.
So it's so an enlisted guy would be an electrician, and he would be expected to be an amazing electrician and continually get better at it. Versus an officer goes in and says, you need to know enough to be dangerous at all of these things, so you can speak intelligently to your soldiers, because you never know which unit you're going to be assigned to. And indeed, it is a mystery, right? So I knew I was going to Hawaii, but in Hawaii there was a cartography and map making group. There was a Corps of Engineer, like large level construction project. There was a heavy construction unit, and then there was a light combat engineer unit. And so the light combat engineer unit tends to focus more on the explosives and putting in and taking out landmines. And so you get a lot of focus training on that. But at the same time, if you are someplace and the infantry unit that you are attached to needs something done, they ask you to do it, and you say, okay, and you figure it out. So you pick up amateur carpentry skills and electrical skills, and the soldiers you have are an amazing wealth of knowledge for all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
So, like when I was in Hawaii, my first infantry battalion, they came and they asked me to build them a outdoor obstacle course. So they used to have one, and it was gradually getting old and nasty. And so I, with my basically my platoon sergeant, kind of took over a bunch of training. We set up a bunch of things of what we wanted our guys to do, and I went through a huge amount of design, researching in military field manuals of how to build all this stuff. Called around to get a telephone company to donate telephone poles that were brand new to us. Figured out how to file dig permits and go to not just military people, but civilian people too. So I had to go down to the gas company and the electric company and all these different people to get dig permits, design all this stuff, get all the materials required, put in bills for sale, all this stuff, giant drills, giant lag bolts, get cranes involved.
Wow.
And my guys went out there and, they didn't have training in how to build all this stuff, but guys fired up chainsaws and cut down the old stuff and propped up the new stuff. And, the last time I visited Hawaii, the shit's still there. So, we did a decent enough job. Now,
and that's funny because you don't think about that. I mean, you think about these army bases with the obstacle courses and stuff, but it's the engineers, it's those guys who are actually designing it and putting it all together and stuff.
Yeah, we built it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's cool. Well, okay, so when you got out of ROTC, graduated, did you immediately go to Hawaii after that?
I went to lieutenant school where they teach you all those general skills, and then I went to Hawaii after that. So when I was in lieutenant school, I really wanted to go to Ranger school, and we had maybe 20 or 30 of us that were all trying to basically get ourselves in shape and practice and train to go to Ranger school. And we were being led by, there's a different military school just for engineers called Sapper School. And so it was an ex-Sapper School instructor. And so he was training us through all this stuff, and I messed up my knee in the process, and I had to drop out of the training program. So I was still able to do PT, but I just couldn't keep up with everybody else. And out of our 20 or 30 groups, 6 people got slots to go to Ranger school. And out of, I think one person made it through, all the rest of them didn't. And so I went to Hawaii, and I was kind of bummed that I didn't get to go to Ranger school. And I showed up, and almost my entire battalion was deployed in various different training places, and there was this small contingent left, and they said, hey, go fall in with those guys. I think we got you a Ranger school slot, but it'll be in like January. So these guys are getting ready to go to Sapper school. Why don't you just train with them? So I said, okay. So I was with them for about a week, and we ran and, knots and explosives and a bunch of other different things. And they came to me and said, hey, look, one of our guys isn't going to be able to go, so we've got one slot. Do you want to go? And I said, well, I still didn't have a place to live. My truck wasn't there. My household goods weren't there. And I'm like, how long do I have to decide? And they're like, yeah, about 30 minutes. So I went to the first sergeant who'd been training us. I'm like, is this something I can do? Like, I've only been training with you guys a week. He's like, sure, you got this, sir. And, talked to him later on in life, and he basically said, yeah, I had no idea whether you could do it or not, but I figured you just needed the boost, so there you go. And so I said, sure. So I took the first department that I walked into, which was a dive, and got my household goods delivered, and jumped on a plane and flew back to Missouri, where I had just come from. And I went to sapper school for about a month. And so that was a lot of just, again, intense explosives,
So what's
landmines.
sapper?
So a sapper is an old term that describes the person who burrows underneath a wall of an enemy fort and either destroys it through, they put a bunch of wood down there that then they set fire to, or they put a bunch of explosives to cause the wall to fall down. So that's what engineers do. So engineer's symbol is a castle. So it's either building fortifications or destroying them. And so sapper school was kind of invented as a complement to ranger school for engineers, to carry a bunch of things and do engineer-specific type tasks of putting in landmines, taking out landmines, doing recon on other people, blowing up things at various places. It is much more cerebral than ranger school, I will say. You do a lot more rock climbing and rappelling, and you rappel out of helicopters. You jump out of helicopters into a lake, and you inflate your clothes, and you make your rucksack waterproof when you float that to shore. You do stuff with rafts, like on the lakes, and PT with it, and it has a very low graduation rate. And so anyways, so a group of us went, a much smaller group of us came out the other side. The first 12-mile road march I ever did was at sapper school, and I had no idea what the hell I was doing. And I sucked all of my water dry after about the first 6 miles, and then I was probably close to being a heat casualty, and one of our sergeants came by, and he's like, "You don't look good." And he gives me a handful of Brock's Candies assortment, and he's like, "Always have lickies and chewies, sir." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I popped one in my mouth, and like whether it was the sugar or the nutrients, whatever, the salts, kept me going, and I made it through the piece about a minute left to go, and I was so out of it that I just kept going, and they had to like come grab me and pull me back and have me sit down because I didn't know where the hell I was at the time. Yeah.
So you finished.
So I finished.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sense of accomplishment.
Sense of accomplishment, and then I came back to Hawaii, and they said, "All right, here's your ranger school slot. As soon as you come back, we'll get you a platoon."
So was there a base in Hawaii that you were stationed
Yes,
at?
Schofield Barracks.
Okay.
And so there's usually a week before ranger school where you show up and you take the PT test, and they have all this administrative stuff. They basically try to wash out as many people as they can at ranger school because they have way too many people and they don't have enough instructors to keep track of you all. So it makes their lives easier if they have 50% less or something like that. So instead of doing 0 week like they call it, I decided it would be a good idea to fly to Italy and see Rose, who was my girlfriend at the time. Mm-hmm. So that was far more spiritually uplifting than it was going to 0 week for another week.
So is Rose Italian?
No, but she was studying over in Italy at the time.
Okay.
She's been there lots of different times. And so I show up to ranger school, and I think its basic purpose is to teach you how much you can suffer and still get something accomplished, right? That all of you are working together. Like, I've never been as cold, I've never been as wet, I've never been as hungry. Before I went, I read stories about the North Vietnamese could smell Americans coming a mile away because somebody would like be eating peanut butter and they would just smell it, or bubble gum or something like that. And, you would burn through all of your fat and you'd be burning muscle, everybody would reek of ammonia. And if you were the first person in your platoon, the last person would be almost half a mile away, and if they opened up a piece of bubble gum, you could tell what flavor it was because you were that hungry.
Wow.
So, for years I used to carry around food in my pockets, like as a platoon leader. I had a box of these army-made power bars called Hua bars that were just god-awful and nasty, and nobody would eat them but me. And I would probably have 2 of those in my pocket every day, no matter what. and I'd eat 1 or 2 a day. Like, I lost close to 50 pounds while I was in Ranger School, and I gained it almost all back immediately, to the point where my cheeks were so big I couldn't see down. I had to turn my head because my body was just packing things away. Like, when I came back, our Battalion XO told the cooks that I got special permission to go through the line twice and only pay once, because like I would put everything that they would give me on a tray, and I would eat all of it, and then I would go back and do it again and eat all of it, and sometimes I'd go back for more. And like, people would bring their friends over to watch me eat, because I was like,
All because of the training, because you've gone through that, and it shocked you so much that
right,
your
my body was just like, I will take all of the calories
Give
you
me
can
all.
give me. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Like, on the instances where we got hot breakfast, I remember in the mountain phase, I ate 2 pancakes, grits, oatmeal, cold cereal, sausage, bacon, eggs, a carton of milk, a thing of juice, and we would eat all of that in about 5 minutes.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You should have done competition eating.
Yeah, I know. And then you wouldn't eat anything again for till like dinner time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You know. And but like,
Wow.
I was there in the winter time, and I think I got the only tick that was even awake in Georgia at that particular time. We came back from the field, and I'm taking a shower, and I feel this thing on the back of my neck. Ask the guy taking a shower next to me, because they're like the old school showers where everybody's in one room. He's like, you got a tick on your back. It's like, well, get it off. No, man, I'm not touching that. I'm like, shit. So you only have a certain number of hours of sick time. You can be gone before you're booted out, and you have to take it over again, take Ranger School over again. So I didn't want to go see the medics, but I was like, I don't want to get Lyme disease either, so fine. So I go there, and there's like 5 other people. And you have this bored medic sitting there. What are you in? What do you need? Because they've heard it all. And it's basically people mostly just trying to get out.
Yeah.
And I was like, I got a tick. She's like, what? There's a tick in my back, and you get pulled out. She's like, oh, you come with me right away. Okay. So she takes me back to room, pulls off my shirt. Oh, yeah, yeah. And she pulls out a magnifying glass. Hey, Doc, come see this one. So the doc comes out. Oh, yeah, you got a tick back there. How'd you get a tick? It's like I didn't find it. Just pull the damn thing out. How hard is it? So he calls in the other doc. So, like, nobody's getting medical treatment except for me, and I've got 2 doctors and a nurse sitting in there with me. And they got the scope out, and they're just making sure they pick all the stuff out and send it off to be examined for Lyme disease and all this stuff. And I'm like, just, like, how fucking hard is this? Just, like, grab it and pull it out and move on. But, yeah.
Well, okay, so how long were you in Hawaii then?
Technically for 3 years, but I actually lived there for maybe a year and a half.
Okay.
So, between being gone for training and then when I was, after I was done being a platoon leader, we were out in the field doing that live fire that I told you a little bit about. And, like, I just remember in the morning when my soldiers came and got me as we were getting ready to go do another episode. And he's like, sir, you got to come see this. And one of the guys had smuggled a TV from the barracks, and like there's this group of guys, and they're watching the towers come down.
Oh.
And we're like, oh shit. And so I go down and talk to the infantry commander. It's like, what are we doing? And so our unit was on DRF, I think 2. And DRF stands for Defense Readiness Force. And you have various different levels, and what it means is you are basically the on-call unit for generally half the planet that is supposed to be able to pack up everything you have. And if you're on level 1, it's within 24 hours, and level 2, it's within, I think they give you 72, and level 3 is you get basically 4 or 5 days. And when they mean everything, it's like all your guns, all your ammo, all your vehicles, like there are no leaks, there's no nothing, right? And so we had gone through all this stuff to get ourselves to DRF. You know, a different battalion was 1, and then our battalion was 2. And then they said, well, you know, nothing ever happens, and this is great training time, So the hell with it, let's go train. Well, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to take your vehicles out. Your vehicles are supposed to be like leak-free, ready to be put on a plane. All your weapons are supposed to be clean and functioning. Like everything is supposed to be packed and ready to go. And so we scrambled like crazy. We're going back in, like the base is locked down. Nobody's going home. Everybody's frantically cleaning like everything, trying to get ourselves ready. We're breaking through the book and all this stuff. And I was the first officer back in my engineer, in the engineer company that I was in. So I took over as company commander because we didn't have cell phones back then and we didn't have radios to reach the actual company commander who was with a different guy training. So I was the acting company commander of the battalion, or attached to the brigade that is supposed to be Defense Readiness Force. So I just grabbed the first lieutenant that I saw, who happened to be a poor guy who was his first day with our unit. And he was like all warm and happy. He's like, "Hi." I'm like, "You go here, like talk to this guy. He's going to tell you how to get to brigade, and you're going to sit there and you're going to take notes and you're going to call us once an hour on this number, and you're not going to leave and go home. Like that's your job. You're just going to sit there and you're going to take notes until I send someone to relieve you." And I'm a first lieutenant and he's a second lieutenant, and I'm like, "Just do it." And he's like, "Oh, okay." So he runs off, and 5-6 hours later, our company commander comes back in, and I give him the briefing on what everything's going on, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, by the way, we got a brand new lieutenant, but he's over here at this brigade headquarters." It's like, "Oh crap!" So we got him eventually, but it ended up being that our division commander had to call up the Pentagon and say, "We know Afghanistan is in our area, and we know we're supposed to be ready, and we aren't." And as a result, the entire division was basically punished, and they weren't sent to war for years because the Pentagon had lost faith in their ability to do it. Yeah. So instead, we got sent to Bosnia, and
So, well, that's interesting you say that because by that point, was the U.S. mission in Bosnia was mostly NATO. It was at the time, right?
Right, we were. So we were NATO. It was a whole NATO mission.
Okay, but when you went over there, it was in 2001.
It was 2002.
And I didn't realize we still had forces over there at that time.
We did. We had forces there till at least 2004.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So what was the primary role that you guys had to fill at that time over there?
So they kept kind of winding down the total number of forces. Initially it was a peacekeeping, keeping the Serbs from attacking the Bosnians. Then it became kind of a training mission for everybody. And then when I was there, it was mostly hunting for war criminals was what kind of the overarching mission was. Removing landmines, doing weapons, so confiscating more weapons than the Serbs should have had, making sure the Bosnians had enough weapons, training up the Bosnians. That was kind of the larger overarching mission.
So for as far as war criminals go, like what sort of guys were you looking for? Like what?
So let's see. We were looking for Vladic. I think they'd gotten Milosevic by then.
That's what I had in mind.
Basically, there's quite a few who were still on the run and still hiding, and for whatever reason were still in Bosnia. I don't, for the life of me, these people were basically mafia type, villains, and why they didn't just flee back to Serbia where they could have hid out, I'm not sure. But regularly we'd get some intel briefing because my unit was on the road all the time, and they'd say, "Be on the lookout for a black SUV. If you see it, like, just call it in, don't approach it." And I'm like, "We're in an armored Humvee with armor and, machine guns. We can probably take him. And then also, like, you have to give me more than a black SUV because there's, like, thousands of black SUVs out there. Like, I'm sure he's not in a Lada or a Yugo or some of these other cruddy things, but I'm not just going to, like, pull out and stop every single one.
Yeah.
Because, hell, that's a good way to get, like, the State Department mad at you. So,
what was it like in Bosnia? I mean, what describe, when you first got there, I mean, this is your first time going into a war zone, essentially, or what was a war zone.
Yeah.
What was it like?
So actually, I went to Croatia in '98 when I was a college kid,
Okay.
because one of my buddies from high school, he and I were studying over in Europe together, and his family was Croatian, and nobody had heard from him in a very long time. So we went over to try to like find them, which was probably foolish. And then we had a bunch of other people kind of tag along, and it turned
Before you were
into
in the military, right?
yeah, and it turned into this kind of like weird trip to middle of nowhere Croatia, near the border with Bosnia, and then we just kind of came back. But we got to see the results of landmines, the results of war, the bullet holes, the everything else. But so Bosnia was kind of like, it's this weird mishmash of countries, because if you get too close to Italy, it's really dry and you grow good grapes there, and it's hilly and kind of more limestone, and you get more towards the center and it's hilly and mountainous and clear rivers and waterfalls, and then you go up to the north and it gets almost kind of like Germany, and it's more flat and good agricultural land. But the people were very nice. They were very just burnt out. You know, you could tell they were tired from all the years of conflict and trying to move past it. So my job, my unit that I was with, there was 8 of us total. I had 3 sergeants, and then the rest were enlisted. And we would drive out and we would help out and supervise demining. And so the Bosnians and the Serbs would do their own demining, and we would get supplies, supervise, occasionally help out, make sure they blew up the stuff that they found instead of just pocketed it. Make sure that they weren't just phoning it in, because their salaries were being paid by the NATO for a NATO demining mission. Sometimes you would have a minefield that you could actually get like a flail in. So a flail is a giant spinning bunch of chains in front of like a combine that's been armored. And so the chains smash and break apart these landmines most of the time before they have a chance to explode, or at least when they explode, they don't explode as bad as they normally would.
Wasn't that a British invention for D-Day?
I think so.
Yeah.
And so they'd bring in these flails, and so if you had a nice big wide open area, you'd drive the flail through, and then you'd bring in the dogs, and the dogs were just amazing. And so you'd set up lanes, and these handlers worked with the dogs all the time. We had to make sure they were treating them right and got supplies for them. The dogs would smell the explosives. They would grab the explosives and then detonate it if they needed to, or oftentimes it's just the leftover shrapnel and debris.
Yeah.
And if you had that, you could clear an enormous area in a very short period of time, a matter of weeks. And if you didn't have that, it would take you months, because it's basically you're doing it by hand, and the technique is each person has a lane the width of their shoulders. You're on your hands and knees. You first look for any signs of booby traps. You have shears. You clip away the vegetation with about an area of about 6 inches in front of you. You move that behind you. There's always a guy who's kind of patrolling along who like picks up the stuff you have behind you. And then you have a plastic probe, and a very gentle, at an angle, you push down. And if you hit any sort of object, which could just be a rock or nothing, then you have to gently clear everything away. And if it is a mine, you try to, depending on how it's set up, blow it in place or disarm it and take it back. Those are the only 2 options. And so it basically wears you out. So you have to rotate people in and out. You can't leave them on there too long. Sometimes, because you don't want them shaky when they find one, you don't want them drifting off as they hit something. And so we had no casualties, which was great. And we found all kinds of just random stuff.
So, like the mines themselves, were they? What country manufactured were they?
All of them. Basically, just about every country manufactured landmines forever. So many of them were Italian. The Italians were bad. Many of them were French. Many of them were Yugoslav knockoffs. A bunch of them were Russian.
Modern ones, were they old stock?
These were, they were modern in the sense it was post probably Vietnam. But yeah, so mix of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, a bunch of rockets from RPGs, because the Russian RPGs have a fuse that has to spin so many times before it arms with a piezoelectric trigger. And if it hits something before it rotates that many times, then it just doesn't blow up. But it could blow up today, and you pick it up and you play with it, and it goes. Or it had a nose cone activated firing pin, and if you didn't hit it square on, it wouldn't blow up. And it's still a problem with stuff that happens in Iraq. But so my first day on the job, I show up at a minefield, and I walk up with my interpreter and I say, okay. It's like, hey guys, how's it going? Some guys have come down from the hills. Did you find anything today? Oh yeah, here, catch. And he throws me an RPG. And I'm like, oh crap. Because it's one of those that if it spins enough times, it arms. And so I'm just like trying to do my best football catch of this without hitting the firing pin at the front. And like, I certainly don't want it to drop. And I'm just sweating bullets. And they start laughing. It's like, oh, we disarmed it first. I'm like, you assholes. Like, how do you do that to a guy? And, but yeah, so.
It's the hazing, that's all.
Yeah,
Hazing.
yeah. You're like, it didn't bother the last guy. Great, thanks. But like, you know, we worked with, so the Serbs we worked with were Serb military, and which meant that they weren't good people. And these specific not good people were a member of a group called the Drina Wolves. And they were a paramilitary organization that worked up and down the Drina River, and they would rape and murder and torture and fill up houses full of people and just blow up the house because they didn't feel like wasting bullets on them.
And these were guys you were working with?
And these were guys we were working with. And I didn't have any hard evidence, so we couldn't just arrest him. And they were small enough down the food chain that no one was ever going to do a war crimes tribunal for them. And, you know, it's one of those unfortunate things in the military is you just have to work with people even if they're, you know, you really ought to put a bullet in them, but that's not your call.
How big was the force? How big was the population of these guys?
They had maybe 10 or 12
people. That's it?
Well, no, that I was working with on a regular
okay.
basis. At the time, maybe 100. So there's a whole stretch of Bosnia down, so near Srebrenica, and it was where, so the Drina River is this massive river, and it's carved out quite a canyon, and there's only a handful of roads to get across. And so the Serbs poured in across this one particular portion and then came up along the coastal road. And a couple of Bosnian brothers who were snipers sat up on top of a hill and held off the Serb forces for about 6 months.
Wow.
And had all kinds of things lobbed at them. And so that was one of the areas we were demining, was where these guys had holed themselves up. And eventually they got killed, and then they marched through. And on their way through, like, if you drive through it, you can't find a building without a bullet hole. Like, they just did horrible things to everybody there.
So, what was the background on the Bosnian, the war there? You know, I know what was the political situation there? Like, do you recall what was the story behind that war?
Yes. So, Tito was the communist dictator all the way through almost all of our presidents post-Cold War, all the way up through Reagan. And when one of the things that Tito preached was that religion didn't matter, And any sort of different way of pronouncing things didn't matter. We are all Slavs. We are a united Yugoslavia. And therefore, he would not tolerate any persecution. As soon as he died, you had a group of different people with different mindsets. And the problem in that region is that the Croats were Catholic, the Serbs were Eastern Orthodox, and the Bosnians were Muslim. They were all technically the same people. If you did a 23andMe, they'd all have the same DNA. They all spoke the same language. But everybody was mad at the Bosnians from the time when the Turks had moved through and conquered the whole place and made it hard to be anything that wasn't a Muslim. And they thought that they basically benefited from cozying up to the dictators who were Muslim. And then the Catholics drove them out. And the Catholics were horrible oppressors of the Serbs and the Bosnians. And so people didn't like the Croats either. And the Serbs felt like they kept getting kicked around. And so the Serbs decided that the original pretense was that Slovenia said, Slovenia said, I don't want to be part of your country anymore, we're going to make our own country. And they rounded up the military and they moved through Bosnia and made it almost all the way to Slovenia and then said, you know what, we're just going to fight here. And then they started war with the Croats, and the Croats decided to break away as well, and everything just kind of shattered. And it turned into a bunch of old family grudge matches of like stories your racist grandpa told you about the horrible things that these people who were slightly different than you did to your family, and you owed it to them. And that's what it was.
Really?
And it was not well thought out. There was no effort behind it. It was just casual slaughter. So one of the towns we went to quite often and did some work there was a place called Tuzla. And there's a tunnel that goes through into Tuzla. And for years, the Serbs had artillery pieces parked in the tunnel. And they would drive out and they would shell the town, and then they would drive back in. And they just didn't want to go into the town because there was enough armed Bosnians there that they knew they'd get killed, and they didn't feel like it. So they felt like just enough of driving out and shelling the town to let them know that they meant business, and then they'd pull back. And so when you look at landmine maps of the countryside, they're basically everywhere because the front lines shifted so much over time. And the Bosnians were finally starting to fight and force back the Serbs back across the Drina when everybody got involved and said, okay, let's have a ceasefire, and I think everybody's about ready for it by then.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I didn't realize all that. It was one of the conflicts I just am not well versed on, so I appreciate you explaining that a little bit. So throughout your time you're in Bosnia, and how long were you in there? Where were you in Bosnia?
It was about 7 or 8 months.
7, 8 months, okay. Were there any times where you, aside from an RPG getting tossed to you, where you felt like your life was in danger at all, or any sort of concerns like that, experiences?
A couple. So, one is we were going from our Humvees to go get some coffee, and as we're walking up there, a little kid pulls a gun on us. And he pulls a gun on me because I was the last guy going. And so I pulled up my rifle, and I decided that I didn't want to shoot a little kid.
How old?
He was probably somewhere between 10 and 14.
Wow, yeah.
And I didn't know whether it was a toy gun. I didn't know whether, did he hear stories from his dad about these horrible Americans? He just wanted, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it was just like, I'd feel worse, and it's one of those things that it worked out because he didn't shoot me and he didn't shoot my guys. But if it hadn't worked out, I'd feel terrible about it. And so it's one of those where, in retrospect, you made the right call, but at the time you don't know whether you're making the right call or not.
Right. It was a real gun he had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another instance, we were offloading a bunch of supplies so that we could do some more demining at this one site. And so we set up an impromptu roadblock because we were having to back up trailers on the back of Humvees and get into a specific location. And so I didn't have a huge number of people. You know, I only had 8 of us, so I was acting as the road guard. So I stood there, and up comes a person in a sedan, and they don't stop. And they keep going about 30, 40 miles an hour straight at me. And so I whipped up my rifle, and I aimed, and all of a sudden the person realized that we were real military and not Bosnian military, because many times the Bosnian military aren't armed, and civilians regularly drive around them. And so he slams on his brakes and stops a few feet in front of me. And I put my rifle back, and I turn around, and there's like 4 of my soldiers also with their rifles up. So that car was going to be shredded. And my interpreter runs up there because she was scared about this situation that's going to happen, and she drags them out of their car and just berates them and makes them cry. So it's this grown man crying because my interpreter starts just like chewing him out on the side of the road. But I mean, like, we played soccer in a cleared minefield on the edges of a not cleared minefield, which probably wasn't that bright, but it was a lot of fun. And then there was one time that we took my boss out, and he virtually never got to leave the office. And so he was super excited, and he had a digital camera, and it was like the first digital camera that existed with like a floppy drive, and he's just pumped to go out. And so we take him up to this minefield we were working in. And just as you arrived, I said, "Oh, good, you're here. Good timing. We just found some stuff. We're going to have to blow it in place." So we go up, and I'm talking to the guys, and a person they call it daisy chaining, but there was an anti-tank mine in the middle, so that's about 50 to 70 pounds of explosive. And then attached to it with det cord was a whole series of small little 1.5 pound anti-personnel charges spread out in this array, and if you stripped any one of them, all of them would go off. And so a bunch of the deminers were there, and then we were there, and my boss goes up and he wants to take a picture of the anti-tank mine, and he doesn't see the anti-personnel mine, and he about steps on it and kills us all.
Oh my.
And I had to pull him off and tackle him and chew him out and be like, "You're gonna sit in the car. Like, you don't get to go out anymore." Like,
wow.
You know, I know you think we're just playing around out here, but like, you have to pay attention.
Okay, well, so anything else you want to say about your experience in Bosnia? Any other stories, any other recollections?
Probably my favorite, like, my soldiers that worked for me were outstanding. So I had a person from Trinidad. He was one of my sergeants. I had a sergeant from Colombia. I had a sergeant who was married to a Slav from out there, somebody from Yugoslavia. I had a soldier from Korea.
Wow.
And then I had a soldier from Jamaica, who was about as dark black as you could see. Mm-hmm. And he was the most kind, friendly person imaginable, and he loved languages, and he tried to get better at speaking Serbo-Croatian the whole time we were there. And it was always just so much fun to go places with him, because for many of these people, they'd never seen a black person before except for on TV. Mm-hmm. And then to have him speak their language to them and ask them what their names are and joke around and play soccer with him and a few other different things. And oftentimes these little kids would come up and they'd want to touch his skin because they'd never seen, they thought it was paint and it would just come off. And but yeah, my soldiers were awesome.
So you led a true little multinational force.
I know, yeah, I did. I had this great little multinational force.
So were you still under NATO at that time? Is that why?
We were. So we were under NATO. Every so often I had to go down to Sarajevo, which is where the big demining headquarters was, and they had little districts for all of these different groups. So, Turks and Poles and French and British and German, and so it was kind of fun to go, because you couldn't drink on the American bases, but you could in Sarajevo, because it was special dispensation. And so there'd be all these different people, and you just chat and drink, and half the time you didn't speak the same language, but it was fine, and it was
I bet it was a great experience though when you're there with all these people from different countries, but you're all the same mission. You're all in it, doing the same thing, working towards the same goals together. I bet it was a great experience.
Yeah. The Russians were there too, and they were mostly there for a paycheck. So they were there at Serbia's behest, because the Serbs felt like they were being oppressed by everybody else. So the Serbs and the Russians go way back. And the Russians would do things like set up toll roads where you had to pay them a toll to get through the road. And they stole a bridge one time in the middle of the night. It was a old World War II Bailey Bridge made out of scrap metal, and some enterprising guy brought in a truck, dismantled it, took the whole thing back to who knows where, and we got a call from the mayor the next morning saying, like, there's no bridge. It became like this whole thing of like, where did the bridge go? And the Russian delegation was like, you don't know what you're talking about. There's never been a bridge there. It's like, we've driven across it. Like, you're lying to us. So, one of my jobs was I'd have to go out and check on the Russians who were supposed to be working the same thing that I was, as far as making sure demining was happening, the explosives were being detonated, everything was happening in a safe manner, and all this. And virtually never did I go out to a minefield that they said they were working on and actually find anyone. Not them, not the people they were supposed to be watching. Like one time we went driving off into the high brush until I said, like, okay, this is ridiculous. Like, there is a minefield out here. Like, obviously nobody's done anything out here, and we're going to die. So we had to back up out of that one.
So you think there's still a lot of mines over there? Right?
Oh yeah, they'll be finding mines there forever.
Yeah.
All the fast ones that people made maps of where they put them in. They pulled those out within a few weeks. All the others are just the hasty things that somebody threw down. And if it's not mines, it'll be artillery shells or RPGs or some other thing.
So, after Bosnia?
After Bosnia, I went back to Hawaii, was an XO for a company, that's the executive officer, and did that for a while. Worked for the Corps of Engineers very briefly, managing a construction project, or helping to manage a construction project. And then I went to captain school, and then from there went off to Korea.
Okay.
And I showed up in Korea, and it was just at the same time that they were winding down all the forces and closing all of these military bases. And the unit I was attached to basically volunteered, because they needed something to do, to close all of these bases. And so that became my giant pain in the rear, was grabbing people and sending them off to do all this stuff. And you think about, like, moving out of a house after a few years is bad, and here you're moving out of a military base that you've occupied for probably 40 to 50 years, and there's things like, oh, well, there's a church organ here. Okay. Well, it was donated by such and such person, and it has to go according to this manual to this type. And you're just like, oh man, like, okay. And all the hazardous waste and all the buried munitions and all of this stuff that you have to try to clean up and get going to the right place. And so it was, and then where we were stationed is we were at Camp Casey, which is right up by, not on the DMZ, but pretty darn close. And the whole job of the engineers there is, in the event of the North Koreans' attack, you go out to these rock drops and you put in explosives and you detonate the explosives, and it drops these rocks, because there's only a handful of passes through the mountains from North Korea to South Korea. and you block off anybody's ability to easily get through there. And in general, the expectation is that all of you are going to die.
Wow.
So maybe enough of you live to blow up the rock drops, but even after that, like the artillery barrage, all the other stuff, like, you know, no one's coming to get you, because the other military, that the real army that the U.S. is going to send over is coming from the States. And so your job is to basically try to delay the North Koreans for a few days so that the real army can get there.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
So, how long were you in Korea? Sorry.
About a year.
1 year, okay. What was your impression of the South Korean military? I'm sure you worked with them, of course.
We did, and so the ROK Army is amazing. You know, you'd go by, and they'd be doing martial arts drills in the snow in t-shirts and pants. Like, they're probably every bit as good of a military force as we are. They're just smaller. So they have their own tanks that are patterned off of our Abrams. They have very similar munitions to all of us. We train jointly all the time so that there's no communication problems. Their military is outstanding. It's just slightly smaller. And yeah.
Anything you want to say more about Korea? Any other stories or
I mean,
experiences?
Korea was mostly a miserable time. So our boss was just kind of an unhappy in his particular point in life. And he liked to scream at people and throw things. And we got these video conference pieces so all the commanders could video conference together. And he didn't realize that when you hit the mute button on your phone, it also didn't cancel your video feed. And so the whole division would sit and watch him like scream and yell and throw like erasers and stuff like that, and then compose himself right before he spoke, and then put his talk thing. Oh yeah, everything's great here. We're all feeling happy-go-lucky. How are you? And then he'd hit mute again and go right back to these angry tirades. And I lined up multiple jobs for myself while I was there to not be working for him, to go work for the Corps of Engineers, to go work for an infantry battalion or brigade, all over the place in the division and the Corps that was there. And he shot me down every time. And we were overstaffed. The only thing I can think of is because I went to Ranger School and Sapper School and all these other places, and I had all these tabs, and I looked pretty standing next to him. And but it was right then that I decided I needed to get out of the Army, because I never wanted to be in a situation where I was miserable and I couldn't quit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, after that, when did you go to Iraq?
So after that, I went to Fort Lewis, Washington, and I showed up just as our brigade was deploying. And I took a month of leave between Korea and showing up to Washington, and you know, my incoming unit called me up and said, "Hey, look, we're getting ready to go to Iraq. It'd be really nice if you showed up." And I said, "You know, I've been to war before. Like, it'd be really nice if I spent an extra month with my wife as opposed to like hanging out with you guys. So, you know, you'll get me when you get me." and I remember showing up, and you have to go through all these in-briefing things. And so I'm sitting there with a group of soldiers, and we're at this area where you have to be called back if something shows up on your psych profile or whatever, to go talk to somebody. And this Captain Gilman, yeah, it's like, you said that you consume X amount of alcohol, you know, and that's, you know, hit a red flag in our system and blah, 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 and, you know, these other things. And he's like, I just came back from Korea. And they're like, "Oh, that's normal, you're fine." Like, go ahead. So I showed up to my unit, and I said, "All right, well, we're going to deploy you in like 2 or 3 weeks." And like the first time ever, I usually had a fairly contentious relationship with sergeant majors rather. We didn't always see eye to eye. In this unit, the triple nickel, that sergeant major just walked up to our commander and was like, "Sir, we got a problem. That's not going to happen." He's like, "This guy just came back. He's not going to go. Like, he's going to get 6 months, and we'll go talk to the general if we need to." And so my commander was pissed, like furious at this sergeant major, but he backed down. So I got 6 months to stay home.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was impressive. So I flew in with a small cadre of people. We took a special flight out of SeaTac, and we flew all the way over into Kuwait eventually. And so yeah, we were going through SeaTac and trying to get through security screening. So we're going through a regular old airport, and we're all dressed up. We've got all our rifles. We have somebody check those on the bottom of the plane. They don't care about the rifles, fine. Well, a bunch of my guys have bayonets. They have magazines for M16s.
And this is post 9/11.
Yeah, they have all these different things. The TSA is like, "Oh shit, like, sir, like, I can't, like, legally, I can't let you get on board the plane." So like, "What the hell is your problem?" And they're like, "Well, you got these magazines, like, they're empty. Look at it." He's like, "But it's like in my rule book, and they got these knives." And I'm like, "Fine. What the hell you want us to do?" It's like, I can't. It's like, all right. So I just pulled a bunch of them out. It's like, "Give me a box." So he gets a box. I just dump them in the box and like write down a sergeant's name on it. It's like, "Get this to this post, and this sergeant will take care of it for us." And so like half my group went over there, no magazines, no knives, no whatever, because we couldn't get through freaking TSA security. And
The guns are okay, but no magazines, no empty magazines.
well, the guns were under the plane.
Okay, but you're trying to take the magazines on board?
Yeah, because we were carrying all kinds of shit with us. So, and then our flight into Iraq was like late at night. We get word at the last minute, "Hey, look, we got a C-130 for you." So we all pile on board, strap ourselves in, fly in. So it's red light inside the plane conditions. And
Getting on the C-130
Sure.
and stuff.
so,
Okay, part two.
okay. So a C-130 shows up, and when you're in Kuwait, you have no idea when a plane is going to come available. So we just grab all our stuff, go pile on board, sit down. It takes off. It's in red light mode because they don't want a bunch of lights or anything like that. And as we fly in towards our base, we start getting shot at by somebody and something. And so they start doing these crazy maneuvers. And we hit 0G. Like, I released my rifle, and it's like floating in front of me like I'm an astronaut. I'm kind of floating in my straps. I'm laughing like just hysterically. I think it's the funniest damn thing ever. Then they slam us into the seats again and are banking and doing all this other stuff. There's somebody next to me like going through a rosary, like praying. There's just all this crazy stuff. And I think it's pretty damn funny. This soldier who I'm bringing with me, because it was the last minute, gathered up all of his stuff, but he didn't get a chance to go to the bathroom before he got on board the plane. So he's had to like take a leak since we left Kuwait.
Oh my God.
And this is not helping things any. So he's just like trying not to wet his pants. And so they finally dive down and land us on this base. And it's like pitch black at night. And so we drive to the end of the runway, and so in the back of the C-130, there's a little thing that you can flop down, and you can pee into it, basically. So he climbs over, pulls it down, stands up, and you're standing on these stirrups, and he's peeing, and the tailgate drops, and up comes this forklift with big, huge, bright lights, and it's shining through, and like silhouetting him peeing in front of everybody in there. And he's like, there's nothing he can do. Like, he can't put it away. Like, he had another minute worth of urine in him he had to get rid of. He's like, just hold on, it'll be okay.
Okay, so you land in Iraq?
So we land in Iraq. Well, and then, so we get off the plane, and they cram a bunch of us into this crappy old van. And the runway's blacked out, everything's blacked out, bright, beautiful stars above. This van takes off across, just starts driving, no headlights on, across the desert. And many of us have never been to this particular base before, and we're just like, what the hell? So we start
Night vision or something?
No. He just started driving across the desert, going up and down dunes, and finally nose plants us into a dune and gets stuck. And he's like, I'll be right back. And he just runs out the door and leaves us all in. And so I was like, none of my guys have magazines. Most of them don't have knives. None of us have bullets. I'm like, where the hell are we? It's like the one guy who knows where we are just took off. And it was just, he was new, and he drove the wrong way, and he got lost. And so they had to bring out Humvees to come ferry us back to where we were going.
That's amazing. So you're in a war zone.
Yeah.
Everything's blacked out.
Yeah.
And this happens to you. You're out there in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
No way to protect yourself.
And we have no idea where the hell we are.
Nowhere.
Yeah. It was
What a great introduction.
It was pretty awesome. But so what I ended up doing while I was over there is I took over the construction part. So I worked for the Triple Nickel, which is the 555 Engineer Brigade.
Okay.
They are a kind of a giant engineer brigade that can do just about everything. So they have combat engineers, they have construction engineers, and anyways, they can do a whole host of things. And so over there at the time, we had a construction engineer battalion attached to us, and then we had our combat engineers, and then we had two construction engineer units attached to us. So my role within there was, I was like the giant construction foreman for about the northern third of Iraq. So we were based just outside of Tikrit, and so just north of Baghdad, all the way to Iran, all the way to Syria and Turkey, Tigris and Euphrates, all of that was us. We did bridge repair, road repair, we built barracks for people, we did lots of force protection things. We were getting shelled a lot. Shortly after I got there, the Golden Mosque got blown up in Samara, which is not too far from us. Every week from then on, we had more IED attacks than the week before, until I left.
Okay, so you arrived about when?
I arrived, it was probably around February or so of 2005.
Okay.
Oh no, 2006.
2006?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And then you left?
I left, it was October or November of that year. So, yeah, we did, my guys would do missions for Special Forces guys. And the Special Forces guys would just show up and it'd be like, some guy walks in a beard and a t-shirt and nothing military about him at all, sunglasses. Hey, yeah, we got a new place. It'd be really cool if we could have some electrical stuff and some plumbing stuff fixed to it. And we're like, all right, come on, man. And just attach him to one of my soldiers, and they would do up the designs and what do you need, and then they'd come up with a list of everything, and then we had to get paid for it. And the Special Forces guys were amazing because they had endless funds. They'd just be like, yeah, here you go. And so the stuff would come in, we'd call them up or leave a message for them, and they'd set up a date that was going to be okay for us to come rendezvous, and a bunch of our guys would go out and do all these repairs for about 4 or 5 days, hang out with the Special Forces guys, then bring them back. And they were very nice and relaxed, and the whole time you'd get these ranger units coming in Blackhawks with captured criminals that they would have and be ferrying around. There's a base up in Mosul, and one of our generals decided he wanted to live up there, so we built him a really nice headquarters. Well, it was right next to a water tower that was being used as a target reference point for a guy with mortars and rockets. And the general was tired of having his house being hit. So we went up and blew up the water tower and then sliced it to bits with plasma torches. So
Now, so Saddam was captured, was it December of 06?
Uh, so when I was there, we got his 2 kids.
Oh yeah, Uday and Kusei, right?
Yeah, I think he was captured right after we got back. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. So, so I see on here that you say you got the Bronze Star. Was that in Iraq you got that?
That was.
Okay.
And
Can you tell me about that?
so it wasn't a for valor Bronze Star, it was for effort Bronze Star.
Okay.
So the people that I worked for liked me and thought I did a good job. I mean, that's basically all I can think of to say about it. I mean, the 2 construction battalions that I managed tended to, I think, enjoy working for me. I had a very sharp mind, keeping track of where all their equipment was. I regularly had to call and yell at people who outranked me because they tried to steal our equipment. We designed and came up with like just all kinds of different things. Like the State Department got kicked out of a palace because they were giving the palace back to the Iraqi people, and they got moved to a military base. And they were, so we built them brand new facilities to live in. And it was the nicest quality work that any of our guys had ever done. But it was not marble floors and stone walls. And it was not, running water inside, because we don't do that. And they threw a fuss. Like, their equivalent of a general was called me up and chewed me out. Like, I wouldn't house dogs in here, how dare you? And I was like, this is nicer than any of us live. And
wow.
And they also never paid us because they couldn't figure out how to wire funds from the State Department to the U.S. Army. And so I basically shut her down by saying, and you still haven't paid me. And then she called my colonel and chewed out him, so then we had a conversation. And I said, they didn't pay us, sir. And he's like, oh, well then screw those guys. It's like, okay, good.
Wow.
And for a while, our base kept getting hit by rockets at just random periods of the day. And this one time, my company commander, who I was good friends with, because we were the same rank, anyway, we were out getting coffee. And so we went to get coffee, and we were in a pickup truck, not armored, and we start getting shelled. And so the air raid sirens start going off, like explosions start happening, and we're like, oh shit, we need to get back. So we run out and jump in the pickup truck, and I'm driving and tearing off across the desert, and there's an explosion over here and one over here, so I start swerving around. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, it's harder to hit a moving target. She's like, they're not aiming, you idiot. But,
you might be increasing your odds of driving into the next round, right?
But we swerved, made our way all the way back, and didn't die. But
So you said you were working mostly the northern third of Iraq. Did you have any interaction with the Kurdish forces at all?
Yes, and they were very polite. Like the Peshmerga at the time were moving into Kirkuk. They were moving in, like, just actively, you should not live here anymore. Now we have like 3 families living in that building, type of a thing. And but it was the safest place. Like, you could go there, you didn't need armor, you didn't need to carry your weapon. Like, they were very keen on keeping you safe. And but every time you met a Kurd, they would say, in the future, when Kurdistan is a country, then this will happen. And it was only polite to say, yes, in the future, when Kurdistan is a country. And if you didn't say that, they tended to clam up and be more cross with you. But there is no doubt in their mind that they are going to be a country someday. And I'm pretty right there with them, because I think we should have supported them to become their own country, both then when we were there and currently. But
wasn't there talk at one point, or I think maybe it was Joseph Biden that said something about breaking it up into several thirds? Yeah.
It would have worked far better if we'd have done that, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, my biggest frustration in Iraq is that area that I was doing construction projects and managing, almost the entire piece was conquered by ISIS. And if they didn't burn it to the ground, they stole it, they did whatever with it. So everything that I did was basically useless.
So,
And even now, I realize this will end up being dated, but just the fact that Sadr got the dominant force in the Iraqi parliament, and this guy who, when I was there, was a criminal that we would have executed if we had seen him, who blew up a bunch of people that I knew, like not him personally, but his militias. Like, the idea that he is now in charge of the country that we've spent trillions of dollars and all these people on is offensive.
that's Muqtada al-Sadr, right?
Right.
Yeah, I remember whenever he was in the news a lot back then and everything, and I guess I didn't realize that had happened, so I haven't kept up on that much. That's too bad. Okay. Well, what else? What other experiences did you have in Iraq? I mean, so you're there about 9 months. It looks like roughly.
Well, let's see. So I had to go down to Baghdad for a little bit because they had a big conference where they brought in all the engineers, and at the time they were trying to assess like what equipment you had and what you really needed, because they wanted to reallocate a bunch of engineering efforts to go over to Afghanistan. They had this dream that if only they could build enough infrastructure, Afghanistan would become a stable country, and so they wanted to steal as much as they could from Iraq because it was easier than deploying additional forces from the U.S. And so all of our, we flew down in a helicopter, and I had really bad luck in airborne vehicles because that helicopter got shot at too when I was there. And so we had to bank and do crazy stuff. A few people threw up, and but we landed in Baghdad, and I got to hold these negotiations with all the rest of the engineers in Iraq in one of Saddam's old palaces. And so everything is gold leaf and marble and just these huge echoing halls. And then we've got crappy little folding chairs and other stuff that we're sitting on in these giant places. And there's these huge lakes with koi and other things. And there's all these soldiers who would go out and they'd take leftover chow and they'd go fish for carp and various other fish that I don't think I would eat. But yeah, it was just exceedingly hot and exceedingly humid. And then when our conference is finally over, I couldn't get out. I was trapped in Baghdad because I was such low-ranking officer. I had an important mission going down, so getting me on a flight down wasn't a big deal. But getting me on a flight back, nobody cared. So I was stuck there for several days before I could finally find any plane that even got me close. And it just got me to the next closest base. Then I was stuck there for another couple of days, and then a group came down and drove and got me. And they had IEDs on the way down and narrowly dodged them. And the way back, we were driving right past the same spot, and we could see the IED, and we were going at about 50, 60 miles an hour. So there's nothing you can do, so you just drive through, and he just probably hadn't put the trigger mechanism in yet. And so we made it through and called it back. But the whole time I was there, they would keep coming up with these new advanced ways. It used to be a tripwire, so then the lead Humvee would have that glorified stick with another stick on the front to trip the tripwire and have the explosion blow up. And then put a delay, and then you have a longer stick, and then they'd have garage door openers, and so they had a frequency jammer of the frequency of garage door openers, and then they switched to mobile telephones that you would hit the station, so they had to zap that frequency. And every time they came up with something, we'd spend millions of dollars coming up with a better way to treat it. But one of our jobs was we had a group that would go out at night with a cement truck, and they would fill in all the blast holes with cement, and then they had a special stamp that they would stamp in it so people could see that we had filled it up and not them, because, you know, they got wise to that and started filling up blast holes with IEDs still in it with cement and blowing up people.
Wow. Okay.
And the whole time I was there, the only tanks I ever saw had been destroyed. Like, there's a whole yard full of ones that had rolled into something or been crushed or blown up or burnt out or whatever. Like tanks.
These Iraqi tanks?
No, American tanks.
American tanks.
Yeah.
Wow. Really?
Abrams were basically useless over there, from what I saw. But Strikers worked really, really well with the little mesh or they put around them. It deflected the RPGs. And
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you see a lot here in the U.S., like these MRAP vehicles that are in some, there's one here in Bixby, actually,
Yeah.
police station and stuff. Was that the primary vehicle back then at that
No.
time? I mean,
Still in the Army, almost everybody drove armored Humvees. There just weren't enough to go around. So our demining unit had those. They call them Buffaloes, these giant up-armored mine-resistant vehicles that they got out of South Africa. And they were very effective, you know, at keeping people alive. But most of the rest of us just drove around in Humvees.
Really? Wow. Okay, yeah, and, you know, 2006 was when the surge happened over there, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the surge happened just towards our toe end.
Okay. Did you see, did you see any effects of that?
No.
At that point, you probably
No,
never
the whole,
left before.
yeah, and really, so the surge, part of what happened with the surge also is they got the Solder militia to stop, and then that let them focus on other people. You know, what we saw a lot of, like one of the big problems was well, almost everybody's illiterate over there, right? So people would have these signs on the back of the trail Humvee that would say, "Stop, don't get too close, we will shoot," written in English and written in Arabic, which doesn't do anything if nobody reads Arabic. So somebody drives their car too close to a Humvee, a gunner gets nervous, he shoots him. Well, there's no courts because it's technically a war zone, so there's no justice for that family. So the family feels like their honor has been hurt because this family member has died at the hands of the Americans and nothing happened. So somebody in that family picks up a gun or a rocket or a something and shoots at the next American who goes by. And maybe they shoot a round, maybe they shoot a clip, maybe they shoot a rocket, maybe they quit and join, you know, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, whatever. But that was almost our entire problem. And it just kind of escalates from one to another to another to another. We'd pick up these people. We had a detention center that we built. And they would go around and they'd swipe people's hands. And if you had nitrates on them, they would say, you've been handling explosives, therefore we're going to arrest you. Well, but there's nitrates in all the fertilizer, and almost all the rural poor Iraqis near us were all farmers. So you'd arrest some guy, and he didn't know why he was being arrested, and the family doesn't know. They just know that, like, Americans took him from the marketplace that day, and they haven't seen him. And maybe he comes back in 3 months or 6 months, maybe he doesn't come back at all, but it's a giant insult to the family. And we just kept perpetuating the same crap over and over again. Like, one of my big frustrations when I was there was we got this intel report that some of the local militias were going to blow up, they were going to use car bombs, and they were going to blow up the front gate, and they were going to storm and try to shoot as many Americans as they could. And the State Department interrogators, or I guess not State Department, the intel interrogators had gotten this from a confidential informant. And they told us which base it was. So that meant that I had to load up all these different protective walls and all this equipment, and we had to ship it down and establish all of this extra levels of precautions at this base. And this guy told us what weekend it was going to happen. And it didn't happen. So then they turned to the CI, what happened? He said, oh, well, they saw all the new stuff, so now they switch from this base over to this base. Repeat. So we kept repeating this over and over again until eventually, after, I'm sure it wasn't just me who was complaining, but enough people complained that, like, look, this guy's just playing you and he just wants the food that you give him. And, but one of the times it was our base that it was supposed to be attacked, and our base was very heavily fortified. But one of the guys on guard duty saw a car driving by, low to the ground, wasn't even driving towards our base, and he shot and killed the guy. And the guy just happened to have really crappy shocks. He was hauling some bricks home to shore up his house. And, we murdered a guy for having crappy shocks. And, that, like, Bosnia was like a spiritually uplifting experience. In Iraq, I had good people that I worked with. In my aspect of what I was trying to do, I felt good about. But in general, it was not a good experience, right? Like, we should not be doing nation building. We should not be doing policing. It's not what we're trained for. And you have to make, like, that kid probably felt terrible. Maybe he still feels terrible about what he did, but he had to make some call, and he probably shouldn't have made the call at that time. But you just, the more you do it, the more you get faced with these types of decisions, and eventually it's going to bite you in the ass. So, one of the things I also am is a colonel in the state of Kentucky.
Okay.
Yeah, like Colonel Sanders. And so the reason is we got, so even military bases have what's essentially a mayor, right? So we got a mayor's office sent over from Kentucky. So we had a full bird colonel, his toady henchman, a major, and a couple of other flunkies, right? And so they show up, and right away we did not get along at all. Like, his sergeant major, like, politely told me that I couldn't yell at a colonel the way I had. Like, we had all these emergency exit points from the base, just because if anybody blows up the front gate, you need to be able to get out and go attack them and get people away. Well, he didn't think they were armored enough, and he's like, we need, like, have you seen Mad Max? I'm like, yeah. He's like, we need like armor and spikes and this and that. And I'm like, if you leave from this, it's 10 miles of dunes and desert and nothing. And we have a guard tower right here. And he's like, yeah, but do you think they're paying attention? Yeah, that's their job. He's like, oh, I'm sure they're not paying attention. And, like, he tried to get 50 cals mounted up there, and I'm like, sir, you don't understand that piece of raggedy metal. Like, if you put a 50 cal and started shooting, the whole thing would just collapse down to the ground. He wanted, like, Mark 19s, which are grenade launchers. I'm like, you can't use those. And, like, he had us make these wooden signs that said, stop, don't get any closer, we'll shoot, out of giant plywood and post them out. And, of course, the Iraqis is like, hey, free building material. Awesome. It's even pre-painted. So they stole them within about a week. And so he just kept coming up with these ideas, and it was nothing that worked for the environment we were in. And there were a couple of other different minor construction people building some stuff around base, and he quickly realized that they were lying to him and telling him rosy estimates about, like, when this would happen and when that would happen. And I tell him, like, no, that's, Halliburton is not going to have this built in this period of time. It's going to be a month, and then you'll get air conditioning, and then people can live there. And until that point, they're going to be mad because they're going to be sleeping on a cot outside. And so pretty quickly, all these meetings that we would have, he would turn to me and ask me about what I thought about all this stuff. And then I was done, and then he would just chew out these other people for this whole period of time. So at the end of our deployment, his major calls me up and he's like, hey, the Colonel really appreciates what you did, and, like, he really liked you, and so there's something that he does that he wants to send you. Can you have your home address? I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. So I'm thinking, like, a Kentucky ham or a bottle of bourbon or like, you know, some other random thing. Well, no. This guy happens to run the second largest construction firm in the state of Kentucky. And he is very good friends with most of the governors, including the current one at the time, was a guy named Haslam, whose brother is the owner of Flying J trucking stops in the Cleveland Browns and all this. And so he writes his good buddy and says, hey, I want this guy to be a colonel in the order of the Honorable Order of Kentucky Colonels. So, like, I'm sitting there, and I talk to Rose on the phone, and she's like, who do you know in Kentucky? I'm like, I don't know anybody in Kentucky. Wait, that's it. She's like, why are you a colonel there? I'm like, oh, yeah.
So did you get like some like certificate?
Oh, yeah, I got a plaque on the wall in my office, and I get invited
awesome.
to the Kentucky Derby every year and all that stuff. Yeah,
So it's got perks.
It's got perks, yeah. And so, like I think about my time when I was in Bosnia. If I wanted to call Rose, I had to dial a military operator in Germany, and they would patch me to a military operator in the base nearest where she lived, and they would patch me through to her. And I had, 10 minutes. And sometimes they'd forget, or they'd just let you talk longer. That was it. You had 10 minutes to talk, you're done. Okay. And then, I go over to Korea, and they had these fancy cell phones. This is before iPhones, but really, really fancy cell phones. So I basically had a little card, and I could call her whenever I wanted to. And then you get over to Iraq, and they had this little booth of phones, and your whole brigade is using them, so you got to be nice and all this stuff. But I could call her for 2 to 5 minutes a day, as opposed to 10 minutes a week. And I was like, man, this is technology. This is amazing. Like, I could send emails. I could do all this stuff. And so one time we're on the phone, and we start getting shelled, and there's explosions. I'm like, oh shit, somebody's attacking us. Gotta go. And I just hang up the phone. And then
did that freak her out at all? I mean,
it did.
Yeah.
Because in that particular attack, somebody died, and so they locked down all base communication until they notified the family, which took about 36 hours. And so basically, that when I called her and hung up, she had to then go to work the rest of the day. And the only way she got through it, she says, is that she knew that the Army's really good at finding people, and if anything happened to me, they would find her. And since nobody found her, I had to be okay. But it wasn't till, like I said, about a day and a half later that I can call her again and say, oh yeah, it wasn't me, it was some other poor guy.
Wow. Okay, so you finished up your time in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Were you happy to come back?
Oh yeah. I was happy to come back. Yeah. And what was probably
Were
was
you married then?
I was.
Okay.
I was married.
Okay.
And what was crazy is almost my entire unit was just dissolving and being it wasn't like the unit was going away, but our colonel had been picked up to be an aide to a general in a different spot, and so he left, and our company commander had left most of the way through and was swapped out with somebody different, and our operations officer, who was outstanding, he left to go do something different, and our anyways, just all these different people who were doing all of these great roles came back, and then they just said, okay, we need to run. So, what I asked for my reward for my service was to never have to wear my dress blues again. So when we got back, I told them all, I was like, look, I know I'm getting out, I just don't want to have to get dressed up again. So so the whole unit had this huge change of command ceremony, and everybody's all dressed up, and I was the lone guy. I got to sit in my BDUs in the stands and watch. Oh, that's still my favorite.
Big deal.
That's my favorite award I've ever gotten.
Is it why is that? What's the big problem for you with having to
Oh,
dressed up?
that was always my least favorite part about the Army. right? Like the pomp and the circumstance and the marching in proper order and being dressed a certain way and everything like that. That was never the appeal to me, and it was never anything that I enjoyed. Like, I would usually end up being almost dressed by one of my sergeants who really cared, like pinning things in the exactly, because there's all these different regulations, right? Like, this is supposed to be an eighth of an inch, and this is supposed to be a half an inch, and this one's supposed to be up here, and you have to have this rank here, and if you have a chest full of medals, it gets a pain in the rear. And my uniform's still not right. Like, I don't have any of my service stripes, like overseas service stripes. I don't have any of that stuff. I just don't. I don't care.
Yeah.
It's when I came back from Korea, I showed up in a completely naked uniform. Like, it had my name and U.S. Army on it, and that was it. And my colonel, who I walked in to talk to, was like, "Hey, sir, I'm here. How's it going?" And he's like looking at me, because you wear your tabs over here, and he's like, "Didn't you go to Ranger School?" "Oh, yeah, sir." "Well, why is it not on your uniform?" "Oh, I'm still getting those sewn up." He's like, "Make sure it's on tomorrow." I'm like, shit. I'm like, all right. But it's just, that aspect always bothered me.
Yeah.
Like when I was in Hawaii, we used to have these big, huge, full, it was like a field dress-up event where you'd be wearing helmets and your vest, and then it'd come down of like, well, everybody has to be decorated exactly the same way. So your canteens have to be here, and then yes to ammo pouches, no to ammo pouches, have your ammo pouches full of a certain number of magazines, just all this ridiculous stuff just so that everybody looks exactly uniform. And, you'd have your rifle and a bayonet attached. Well, most of us don't play around with rifles and bayonets, let alone do military drills. And every single time, somebody would lock up their knees and would pass out and would fall back and get poked in the rear or in the leg or something like that and skewered by a damn bayonet. It was like, for a big dress-up event, who cares?
Yeah.
So
you come back from Iraq.
Yeah.
You get out in May of 2007. So what did you do between the time you got back and you were able to get out of the Army?
So I was still, basically from the time I was in Korea, I was always attached to the operations and planning departments of each unit I was in. So I was the senior experienced guy in the operations and planning department, and we just got a brand new major in who was wet behind the ears, and our unit had grown and swelled to be not just engineers but also a chemical division, or a chemical battalion rather, and an air defense artillery group as well. So it was a very large brigade now, but the result of that is that we got a chemical major who had no deployments under his belt and didn't know anything and was brand new, and he was very nice, but he was trying to do operations for this engineer brigade. So I basically did operations for the engineer brigade, including putting together a bunch of the training for one of our battalions that was getting ready to ship out to Afghanistan. So all those forces that I was trying to keep in Iraq, eventually they said, screw it, we'll just grab people who are actually back in the States. And so this is one of those groups. And they ended up going to Afghanistan, and their job was to, I think they spent almost a year building a road down a river valley to connect the north to the south. And so I was trying to train them to not die.
Wow.
And it mostly worked. There was a couple guys who died that I knew. So, but that was it. And then once we got through that, I was starting to think about, like, what the heck am I going to do after this? Trying to find work.
So when you look back on your time in the Army, what sort of things, like, what did it teach you about yourself?
I think certainly one thing that I think the Army is great for is it teaches you a huge amount of self-reliance and self-responsibility. And it's in a day and age where we don't really have like tests of manhood where you go out and you kill a thing and you bring it back to the society and all that stuff. It kind of qualifies, right? So, you know, you reach a point where you've been just about everywhere, you've done just about everything, you have a huge sense of perspective, right? Like, it's really hard to get me stressed out about just about anything because nobody's dying. You know, things might be uncomfortable for a little while, but oh well. Mm-hmm. Like, my wife gets mad at me because even in a pouring rain, I will walk through a parking lot because I've been wetter and I know it just dries.
Yeah.
So I just don't, it's not worth it.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's a World War II vet that Tony and I co-interviewed together here in town. At the end of his interview, he said, you know, in the end, I told myself when I got back to the U.S. that if I had a meal in my stomach, a roof over my head, and a bed to sleep in, everything else is gravy, you know.
Oh, sure.
And you know, I'm sure for someone who goes into the military and has gone through some of the training you've gone through and the experiences that you lived through or anything like that, yeah, I think things pale in comparison, you know. You know, when you think back on your time, I mean, what are some of the things that you're most proud of?
Honestly, my time in Bosnia is probably the thing I'm the most proud of. You know, because each of those things, like, it made an incremental difference to make life better. Mm-hmm. Like, we went to schools and we removed landmines so that kids could go to schools again. Like, there was a
humanitarian component to it.
Yeah, there's a humanitarian component. There's a whole region where it had been part of the front lines, and all these farmers and families had not been able to get back. And we demined this, you know, it was 6 miles by a mile stretch. And they got power lines back in, and we had a big, huge PR event with photographers and all this stuff because these families were coming back and they were going to start to live again. Mm-hmm. You know, you'd get farmers back in their fields. Like, each day you're making things a little bit better for all those people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's just it. You know, I know there's a lot of people who go off about how, you know, I get a lot of thank you for your service and you're helping keep America safe. And I mean, the reality is we're pretty damn safe to begin with. Mm-hmm. And they'd attack the Twin Towers whether we had a giant military or a small military. So most of the missions that the Army does these days are humanitarian or peacekeeping types of things. You know, we're not fighting the Russians or the Chinese. These aren't people who are invading and attacking Americans, and we're not defending. Like, we know how to do that stuff too. But, so because of that, it ends up being, I guess, more spiritually fulfilling when you actually are helping people out.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in closing, is there anything else you want to, say, or any stories or recollections you want to make sure you did fit, and of course what we talked about, or anything else in closing?
Oh, I've got a billion I could go on all day. I'm good.
Okay, well, if you got nothing more to add, I guess this will be the close. So anyway, thanks for your time. Thanks for recording your stories here with me and stuff.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Thanks, Jesse.